Salvis Search for the Universe. Chapter 7. Brown stirred. His crusty eyelids were glued together with sleep sand and dried, drunken sweat. He peeled them open and peered through blurry eyes. A shaft of light cut him in the eye and ignited a splitting headache. He moaned, squeezing his eyes shut and crushing his own head, as if pressure could stop the sanguine pounding in his brain. His breath tasted like death. What happened last night? He was hangover, so that could only mean one thing. It all came rushing back to him. He cursed himself for drinking so much, and he cursed God for creating hangovers. He forced his eyes open. He had to shove down shock and panic as his eyes darted around the room. This wasn't his house. The room was furnished with only base necessities. It had to be an inn of some sort. He must have checked in and forgotten it while he was drunk. He worked what thick saliva he could muster to moisten his dry, cottony mouth. In that moment, he would have killed for a drink of water. He looked over, and on the nightstand stood a pitcher of water, clean and crisp. God existed after all. He reached over and guzzled down the half-gallon in moments. He set it down. His head still hurt, but he could live with it. From the looks of the shadows, it was nearly noon. It was about time he got out of this place and went to his real home. Being mostly nocturnal, it felt like early morning. He still felt groggy as he raised his arms over his head and cracked his stiff joints. His clothes were on the floor, but whose clothes were those next to them? And where had that expensive-looking pendant come from? Last night was still hazy, but something about it was dully familiar. He tried to get out of bed, but felt an unnatural weight pulling on him. It felt like rolling a wheel with a board nailed to it. And now that he thought about it, what was this thing wrapped around his waist? It was smooth, but it wasn't the sheets. He tried to move again, but felt the same resistance. What strange object was he sleeping with? He folded away the sheets and screamed. There was a naked kobold in his bed, his arms wrapped tightly around his waist. He rolled and spazzed, pried it off and kicked it out of the bed. She flew out of bed along with the ball of tangled sheets. The sudden gravity woke her up in an instant. She yelped moments before striking the floor on her hind end. She rubbed her bare behind and glared at him indignantly.
That hurt!
What are you doing in my bed?
Sleeping!
He didn't know how to respond to that. His headache made it hard to think, and the shock only made it worse. They stared at each other, Salvi burning her big, slitted eyes into him. How did I end up here? He finally asked.
Brown bad at drink. Brown fell asleep in tavern. Gav, Gowan, and Collis picked up Brown and did not know where Brown lived, So put Brown in bed building that costs money.
She crossed her arms and puffed. She was still upset, but seemed quick to forgive.
Brown throw up and say funny thing when wake up.
He had broken up before. He didn't remember that. And how did you end up in my bed? He asked pointedly, trying to avoid her nakedness. But why did he care? It was just a kobold.
Salvi tired and human warm,
She said, as if it was the most natural thing to do in that situation.
Salvi never sleep with human before. Was nice.
His eyes bulged, cold sweat trickling down his back. Oh, God. Had he really? Had he really been that desperate? Could he have done it? She stood up and couldn't help but take in the entirety of her body. Some primal instinct stirred in that moment, and it scared him. He could have done it. If he was drunk enough, he could have done it. Did we really? He swallowed. Did we really sleep together?
Yes?
She tilted her head.
Human still drunk? Salvi never seen one so bad with alcohol before.
His teeth shattered. His eyes swam. He had crossed the line, and worst of all, he couldn't even remember if it was worth it or not. He sighed. There was nothing to do but accept the degenerate he had become. I had sex with a kobold. The words came out as a trickle.
Sex?
Salvi tilted her head the other way. The universe froze. We didn't?
With human? Nope.
She spun around, then made what he assumed was supposed to be an alluring pose.
Unless human want to.
She made a mock seductive face and sniggered behind her hand. No, thank you, he said sternly. That was a relief. But he didn't feel as relieved as he thought he ought to be. That was concerning.
Salvi think it hard to have sex with loin like that?
She pointed to his crotch and the red, cracked skin. He flushed and covered himself with the blanket. Just throw me my clothes.
Okay.
She obliged and threw the pile at him. He had severely overestimated his hungover and sleep-addled dexterity, and was hit in the face with his own trousers. He dressed underneath the sheets out of a strange sense of modesty. What was he getting so worked up about? It was just a kobold. Salvi took the time to don her own clothes as well. She didn't seem very good at it. And the concept of clothes you have to wear rather than throw on seemed to be entirely foreign to her. But she managed it somehow. She finished it off with a pendant and a smile. So, what's a kobold like you doing in this city anyway? He felt an odd need to strike up polite conversation. He had shared a bed with the creature, after all.
Salvi look for Izzy.
Itty, huh? He didn't pry any further. It was probably one of her kobold friends or something. He stood, his head still throbbing. Blessedly, it was his day off. He wouldn't have gone out drinking otherwise. The water had washed down some of his bad breath, and he realized something stank. That wasn't him. He tested the air around the room and followed the scent all the way to Salvi. He leaned in and sniffed for confirmation, and wished he hadn't. Lords above! You smell like you've been swimming in a sewer! He hadn't noticed it over the smell of booze and sour man sweat that filled the tavern last night, but she absolutely reeked. Salvi stuck her nose into her armpit. Perhaps the most unfeminine gesture she could have chosen, and came out with a face that seemed to agree with Braum's assessment. Do you know where the bathhouses are? Salvi shook her head. He started to explain their directions, but after looking at her overloaded expression, decided it was a waste of breath. Fortunately, he always kept some crude paper and a charcoal pencil in his uniform for certain godly situations. So, he drew up a quick map to a sheep bathhouse.
Bath cost money?
She asked suspiciously. It looked like she wouldn't be surprised if he had told her there was a fee for breathing air. It's free if you're a citizen, but visitors need to use the private baths. The cost depends on where you go. He shrugged. Salvi flopped over backwards and swung her arms and legs in a miniature tantrum. It was honestly kind of cute.
Salvi have no money.
What's that then? He pointed towards the bag at her waist that looked and sounded suspiciously like a coin purse. Salvi threw it at him.
Stupid metal rectangles.
He opened it and was shocked to see enough imperial coinage to live for several months in comfort, and years if you were frugal. He slipped it shut, his godly instincts tingling. Where did you get these?
Traded with big scary man.
Trade. He scratched his shin. She honestly did not seem to know what money was, so he doubted she stole it. But what situation could lead to some scary man giving a kobold most people's yearly wage in a foreign currency? He could only imagine. Lesser guards would have confiscated it, claiming it was too suspicious, but he liked to think of himself as better than that. She was still laying on her back, so he set it beside her. This is money, just from another country, the Shale Empire from the south. These silver tokens are worth much more than the silver coins we have here, because they use much more precious metal. Weren't kobolds supposed to know this stuff already? He thought to himself. She shot up.
Metal rectangles money too?
Yeah. Take them to a money trade and exchange them for turnums. Though you could probably find plenty of people who would take them as is. Salvi wasn't really paying attention. She rolled around in regret, then grabbed a coin purse and held it like some long-lost child. Chances are it had once been much fatter, he thought dryly. Abruptly, she sprung onto her feet, jumped up, and hugged his torso.
"Thanks you, Brown,"
she said, and just as quickly fell away, bolting to the door before he could even react. "You're welcome," was all he could say as she slipped through the door and out of sight. She was gone. He felt an inexplicable tinge of loss at that. The whole situation had left him with some complicated feelings that would take many late nights and early mornings atop the city wall to puzzle out. He wondered if he would ever see that kobold again. Salvi. Wasn't that her name? Salvi stared at her map. Was she going the right way? She turned it upside down. It still didn't make any sense. It didn't help that she dropped it in a muddy puddle an hour ago. Did the human give her the right directions? She tried her best to follow it, but it only sent her down several derelict alleys and strange streets. Some scary humans with pointy weapons tried to mug her, but fortunately they didn't seem to have much experience catching things half their size, and she just ran under their arms and out of the alley. But that only made her more lost than before. It was around then that she had dropped it in the puddle, and later forgot she had dropped it and mistook one of the brown splotches as the water in the port. After narrowly avoiding being crushed by swinging cranes and burly men in the midday rush, she made her way across a bridge and through some weird part of the city with red-tinted lamps lit, even though it was the middle of the day. There were human women standing all over the place, and human men would show up occasionally and take the women away. It was very strange. After that, she was chased by a pack of feral dogs, distracted by a meat shoppy, and then chased by a pack of feral children. Overall, it wasn't going very well, and for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Maybe this gap in the map was talking about this alley? She went down the intersection and was greeted by a high wall at the end. That was just great. But she wasn't one to give up. If the map said go down this alley, that is just what she was going to do. She dug her claws into the stone wall's mortar and made her way up, stone by stone. She got to the top and straddled the wall, swinging her legs over and managing to make it to the bottom without breaking anything. She puffed her chest, feeling accomplished. The buildings on this side were all stone and sparkled with white, with carved decorations all over. Carefully sculpted greeneries followed the paths, and the streets were clean enough to eat of. It was nothing like the rest of the city. They were all like that big house she had come from, though not quite as grand, but still plenty impressive. She looked down the street. Several guards were stationed at some kind of gate far in the distance. Was that the way she was supposed to get inside? Oh well, Climbing the walls was probably easier than dealing with a bunch of humans anyway. Humans were walking around, wearing the same kind of frilly, impractical clothing she had purposefully ignored in that closet. They looked and curdled at the sight of her, like she was some kind of kitchen cockroach. If not for her appearance as the expensive pet of some eccentric rich family, they would have called the guards immediately, but instead settled for walking around her in wide arcs. The buildings were really impressive. There were all sorts of... Wait, that human, it had wet hair. Where did he come from? She tried to trace his steps and saw another with wet hair, and another. They were coming out of that building. Steam and smoke curled into the sky above the great structure, fed by several aqueducts. It wasn't so much a building as it was an entire compound. The front pavilion was linked to the street by wide stone steps. Carved stone columns lined its width, and a red carpet urged the visitors towards the arched wooden doors. Salvis scampered up the steps, burst through the doors, and ran up to the man behind the counter. It was warm in here. It all looked so clean and fresh too.
This bathhouse?
She asked expectantly. The prim and proper man at first looked at her, like deigning her with a reply would be far beneath his dignity, but eventually replied in a voice as slimy as an eel.
Yes.
Salvi pumped her arms in victory. The direction the human Braum had given her was right after all. She was sorry she ever doubted him.
How much?
She was savvy to the human world now.
For you?
He sneered.
Isn't the wooden tub at your master's estate enough for your kind?
Salvi frowned at him. She knew he was being incredibly rude, but didn't entirely understand in what way.
How much?
She repeated, more sternly this time. The man behind the counter rolled his eyes.
Such decadent times these are, that one would think to send his pet to bathe with men. Who is your master, anyhow?
When she didn't reply, he simply shook his head.
2 silvers.
She slammed her coin purse on the counter. If he had been drinking anything, he would have spit it out at the sight of its contents. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of person would trust his kobold with this amount of money. It was like trusting a pack of hyenas to babysit your infant son. She handed him 2 silver imperials, and surprisingly he was professional enough to give one back. Likely in fear of incurring the wrath of whatever crazed plutocrat owned this creature, rather than any sense of propriety. He directed her down the hall at the end of the antechamber, and she passed under the arch, entering the complex proper. She looked around, and couldn't get enough of it. Open air whistled through the rows of arches. Humans stretched in the sun in the central courtyard to the left. She hadn't been this excited since she first entered the city. She followed heat and steam along the marble floor and passed by dozens of finely carved statues of famous humans she definitely would have known if she knew the first thing about human history, and made her way between two buildings. Lots of humans were around, and they gave her the same look. Everyone seemed to. Excited, she scampered up and down the path, first finding the latrine and storeroom before the entrance to the bath. She skipped inside and drank in the incredible sight. The great pool was at least 100 feet long. Blue and gold tiles glowed beneath the water, in the sunlight like colored glass trapped in crystal. Statues sat in their recesses, surrounded by patterned frescoes that continued all the way to the ceiling. Dozens of humans soaked leisurely, while servants attended them. Salvi had never seen water look this beautiful. She leapt to the water's side, stuck her foot in, and the cold water sent a shock up her spine. Where was the steam coming from then? She looked all around and found humans going in and out of a small room to the side. Steam curling out from the doorway. That must be it. She bounded for the door, slipped on the wet stone and fell flat on her face, but got up undaunted and promptly slipped again. She compromised to walk half as fast and ran into the room. Heat radiated all around. It warmed her cold blood to the marrow. It was just as beautiful as the previous room, but smaller. The water was warm, but the steam told her it should have been warmer. She was confused at first, until she saw another doorway and ran through it, half as fast of course, and stepped into a wall of steam and heat. Now, this is what she was looking for. She only barely managed to stop herself from jumping in head first, remembering she was still wearing her nice human clothes. She stripped them off and was about to drop them on the floor before she saw one of the humans throw their clothes into some kind of slot in the wall. So she did as well. They fell into the darkness. She poked her head down the hole. How was she supposed to get them back? She decided it was something she could worry about later, and stepped up to the water. Heat already licked at her toes. There were humans already in the water, mostly women. She had seen a naked man earlier, but it was her first time seeing a naked woman. How did they even live with those big blobs of fat on their chest? It seemed terribly inconvenient. Though she heard milk was supposed to come from them, she thought about it. Having milk wherever you wanted, it seemed awfully convenient for traveling, but she couldn't imagine carrying those things around all day. She continued to leer at the women. For some reason they covered their chest and started to leave the room in disgust. Eventually, she was the only one left, which she thought was great. She stepped into the water, sank down to her neck, and oh God, was she melting? Her eyes rolled into her skull, her tongue lolled. The near scalding water warmed her cold blood to boiling, until her whole bloodstream seemed to fizz with warm energy. It unkinked her muscles and soothed away sores and pains she didn't even know she had. The water smelled faintly of roses. It felt like her soul was floating in her skull.
Humans built this?
She thought, with the few brain cells she could manage, that were not wholly focused on this world of nigh, indescribable pleasure, pounding her body from every direction. Did she even need to go to Panes? Did she even need to find Iti? She had already found heaven. It was right here. She soaked for several minutes, eyes to the ceiling. It took several more before she remembered herself enough to float around and explore other parts of the pool. She swam up and down, feeling the new sensation of water rushing and rolling around her limbs as she moved. Fresh, hot water poured from jugs from an ornate statue built at the back of the pool. She sat under it and let it splash all over her body, completely content. Paradise. Absolute paradise. She could soak here forever, so she did for another several minutes. Her head felt light, and the world started to swirl. But that was probably because she felt so good. Chains rattled. Raw screams echoed through the cold, uncaring walls. The dim light from the burning furnace cast demonic shadows across the torturous face in his personal chamber of pain. Countless tools of terror and anguish lined the walls, each cruel and terrible in their own way. That time would come. Today he stood over the burned and bloody body of a man. His face had once looked so cocky and strong, but now it was broken, twisted into a rictus of pain and terror. His body twitched and tremored. His arms and legs were bound, one loop of rope from each limb, stretched over the thick frame of the rack. His limbs were taut. There wasn't even room left to struggle. Lord Farrell's watched from the bench. Abrams sat not far away. The torturer cranked the wheel. The man screamed and begged. The rack groaned and creaked. His bloody screams fell on deaf ears. The cranking stopped. He was an expert at his craft. His craft was pain. The joints were at their limits. Any more and they would crack, and it was far too soon for that.
Please!
He screamed, voice deadly hoarse and dry.
You need to believe me. Oh God! Oh God! I'm telling you everything! Everything! Oh God!
Fresh tears trickled down his already tear-stained face. Funny, the torturer thought, how such lawless and profane men always cry for God in times such as these.
He came to me 8 days ago. He paid me 5 gold imperials to smuggle some cargo. How was I supposed to turn that down?
Oh God! How? Why? Oh God! No! Please! I... He screamed as the glowing metal bubbled and boiled his skin. He couldn't thrash. He couldn't struggle. All he could do was curl his toes and fingers. Please! I'm telling you! I never saw him after that! He never showed me his face! Please believe me! I didn't know, I don't know what they were! I don't know what he was going to use them for! The torturer looked at the Lord, who sliced the air with his palm. He nodded and grabbed the spokes of the wheel. Slowly, so slowly. Making a show of it was part of the torture. Giving them time to imagine the pain in its entirety before giving it to them. He shook his head and screamed and pleaded and begged with every inch of his soul. The wheel turned, the rope pulled and pulled. His knees and shoulders ripped from their joints with 4 sickening cracks. The ear-piercing shriek was swallowed by the dungeon. No one but the 3 in the room heard his cries. The torturer leaned in and whispered,
We can keep going until we rip your arms clean off. Tell us the truth, and you might still walk one day.
His eyes were lost in a faraway place. Perhaps that had been too much, too fast. It was troubling if they began to wish for death too early. I'm telling you. He no longer had the strength to scream. I've told you everything. Everything. He wept bitterly. Lord Pharaohs stood up. That's enough. The torturer released the tension. Broken limbs fell free and limp. He did not move. Thankfully, after the first burn, his experience told him the man was telling the truth. But with circumstances the way they were, it didn't hurt to be certain. It didn't hurt him, at least. The stone-faced torturer giggled internally. Abram sat passive, then stood and walked to the broken man. He grimaced. He had never cared much for torture, but he couldn't argue with the results.
Tell me, Mad Devin, you say he had an accomplice, that man who brought the actual goods to you to smuggle? He was swarthy and had black hair and green eyes, but never spoke to you, correct?
That part of his testimony was corroborated by the guards at the gate. Yes.
Tell me everything you remember about his wagon.
Bandar barked orders at his soldiers. They jogged across the paving stone as a unit. His heart was pounding. His life depended on this. How had that creature evaded him so easily? They had been chasing it since they spotted it at least 30 minutes ago, but every step, every turn, it had evaded them. Every time they attempted to surround and capture it, it would turn down some forgotten alley and slip past them effortlessly. And this happened every time. Every time! It was unthinkable. How could they have known they were being chased? They had been so careful, but these movements had left no room for doubt. They knew they were coming before they even showed themselves. His heart had leapt with joy when it ran down a dead-end alley. At least half a dozen soldiers had given chase, only to find it empty and lifeless. It had taken him a moment to realize that a creature had somehow climbed over the sheer 16-foot wall and jumped down the other side. The scratch mark left in the mortar left no doubt. It had completely outsmarted them and was now running around somewhere in the aristocratic district. Over 24 guards were jogging up and down the pristine streets. The residents looked at the armed men with spears at the ready in shock. Women clutched their chests with dainty hands, grasping, wondering what plebeian crisis could have invaded their sacred oasis. After it had climbed the wall, it vanished. They had wasted minute upon agonizing minute, searching the street until his men had tracked down some aristocratic blowhards that claimed to have seen it run into the bathhouse. No one had yet seen it leave. That creature was still in there. He didn't know what they were planning, but he couldn't afford to pass up this chance. He and his men rushed up the steps and burst into the reception, spears at the ready. The man behind the counter let out a girly scream as 30-something guards rushed in. Men and women screamed in shock at the sight of them, and fled in fear of whatever terror was lurking inside the bathhouse that required an entire platoon of soldiers to dispatch. "Fan out! Search every inch of this place! Cover all the exits! No one is going to leave until we find that damned beast!" He surged ahead. Where was it hiding? Where was it? He felt his neck, imagining the lick of the guillotine should he fail.